This presentation explores some of the ways World War I generally affected fashion. The war galvanized so many changes already in the zeitgeist and forever ended some ways of looking at the world. The romantic notion of war quickly fell to the grim realities of state-of-the-art war technology. The carnage was devastating, and more than 1 million people died. We will go into the war romantic idealists and come out modernists. As with any major war, military uniforms will inspire fashion. In this war, officers' uniforms will be largely the same as enlisted soldiers' uniforms. This sense of democracy is the result of the change in war tactics. Combat officers now served alongside their men instead of sitting on lofty hillsides directing strategy. New chemical gas, modern artillery, and airplanes did not care who was an officer or not. Another new practice ended the romantic ideal of military service, mass conscription on a scale never seen before. This ended the idea of being a military officer as a noble profession for the younger sons of aristocrats. Those dashing uniforms of the past would freeze as dress uniforms for special events. On the left, we see Kaiser Wilhelm in the darkest uniform, reviewing his troops with some of his officers. There are only very slight differences between them and the soldiers in the background. All wear a sack-style coat, or tunic as it is called in the military. On the right, we see an officer in the center and an enlisted soldier on the far right with few distinctions. Uniforms are now drab olive and khaki colors, not the blues or reds seen for generations. The modern uniform embodies many traits we will come to associate with modernism, matching the look of the clothing to efficiency and comfort instead of inherited traditions, matching the uniform to the background as camouflage, making soldiers harder to target, and the uniform decoration and insignia were made much smaller. Another new development is a contemporary style of armor to combat the explosives, shrapnel, and chemical gases prevalent in modern warfare. These images introduced the idea that all that technology we spent a century creating may now be more than we can control. In 1917, this photo op was staged for the British press, showing medieval armor and modern armor. Today, we are probably used to the idea of body armor, but before 1914, it had virtually disappeared from warfare. Even animals were outfitted with gas masks. America did not enter the war until 1917, considering it a fight among European nations. But the war took its toll when German submarines began to attack our ships. Germany was very close to making an alliance with Mexico, giving us the specter of warfare at our own doorstep, and so we went to war. African American soldiers served in World War I and found they were treated much better in European countries than they were at home. An expat group would stay on, particularly in Paris. Those that returned faced a wave of racial violence. They would start in motion the resistance that would become the civil rights movement. One visible fashion influence occurs when the Burberry gabardine coat goes to war, with some modifications. The sleeves have belts around the bottom to cinch in, keeping rain from running down the sleeve. There are deep slash pockets conveniently placed toward the side front, and a belt cinched the coat in to control the volume. Epaulettes on the shoulders held military straps, such as holsters or supply belts, in place. And the deep notch collar is distinctive, allowing the coat to be worn entirely buttoned up with the top collar standing up for additional warmth. We will see these elements enter fashion in the next few decades. Soldiers also brought the trench coat home with them from the war, where it was adopted into everyday wardrobes. Even regular coats took on military-inspired details. The wool coat on left uses a partial belt around the sleeve bottom, and the coat at right uses the waist belt. There's also a renewed interest in the reefer coat or pea jacket during and after the war. It was invented by the Dutch, and nearly every navy and merchant ship had adopted it in the 19th century. It was primarily associated with sailors and working men until the war brings it to civilian wardrobes. The deeply notched collar also stands to shield the neck. Women go to war as well as filling the many vacancies at home. Many socially prominent and educated women participated in war for the first time in history, for things like nursing jobs, intelligence, and clerical work. Some were posted near the front lines. Their ability to work in harsh conditions destroyed the innocent flower view of women. Working class women filled the empty factories, making munitions, farming, and every other kind of job. This will be the first time society sees thousands of young women in uniform. Even women that were not officially enlisted in the military joined relief organizations or support foundations and adopted uniforms. Overnight, women's wardrobes expanded to include smocks, trousers, bloomers, and functional garments. The women on the left are welders wearing a smock and trousers. Here we see women in bloomer overalls working on the railroad tracks in France. The battle for women to wear civilian trousers would begin in earnest after the war, as we will soon see. Women on the home front incorporated military details into their civilian fashions, such as braids and buttons. They also borrowed from historical uniforms. You can see the hats are small tricorn hats with feather cockades. There was a shortage of wool, which had been requisitioned for military uniforms, so women developed ways to refresh last year's fashions. These illustrations show ideas to add fur to last year's styles to freshen them up. The average woman wore day dresses such as these. They were available in cotton for house dresses, school, or work. More wealthy women wore silk dresses seen on the right. All the dresses are relatively plain with small details such as collars and sashes providing much of the decoration. However, they still feature many more fine sewing techniques than you will find in our clothing today. There was no shortage of skill and imagination even in wartime. Women stopped wearing a lot of jewelry as they had during the Belle Epoque. Such a display during wartime deprivation was considered vulgar and unpatriotic. Fashion plates stopped showing much jewelry at all, as we can see on the left. Colors during the war were more drab. Almost everyone in the European countries knew someone lost in war, and everyone was bereaved. The mood was sober, and bright colored dyes were difficult to get when the chemical industry turned to war manufacturing. In fact, another reason colors were drab was because almost all of the synthetic dye companies were based in Germany. From 1914 to 1919, the Allied powers imposed a naval blockade on Germany, and in return Germany imposed a naval blockade on the Allies, with few goods getting through the lines. One dye color available outside of Germany was sulfur black. Manufacturers then enlisted the help from designers and fashion magazines to promote black and white as a patriotic and new vogue to alleviate the problem and boost morale. American manufacturing was less affected due to a few domestic dye firms. Several were owned by German immigrants who brought their technology with them. Once America entered the war in 1917, American textile companies received a gift from the government when the Trading with the Enemy Act was passed. This allowed any company manufacturing goods for the war effort to confiscate patents owned by any enemy. American companies freely used the German-developed dyes and the shortages ceased. The way we keep time will change. Modern warfare called for very close timing of munitions, movements, and flying. The traditional pocket watch proved unusable. It took too long to fish a watch out of a pocket, especially if you were lying on your stomach in a trench. Soldiers were issued a wristband to hold their pocket watches. In 1915, the Rolex company created the trench watch, a flat, round watch that directly attached to the band. We emerged from World War I with the wristwatch. Mourning rules changed as lengthy rituals proved to be crippling in wartime. Everyone wearing black all the time was bad for morale. Women working outside the home had less time to prepare years of correct mourning. Women begin to dispense with full black for extended mourning beyond the actual funeral, adopting the old half-mourning colors of gray and violet as an option. In 1917, near the end of the war, Sigmund Freud redefines grief as a private state of mind, and we begin to internalize mourning instead of celebrating it as a large community event. The general practice migrates to black for just the funeral and perhaps a discrete amount of time afterwards. Long black veils are no longer worn after the funeral itself. The veil will shrink to long scarves attached to hats. With modern warfare, many men couldn't be retrieved or found or were hastily buried in Europe, depriving the family of an actual funeral. Society discovers a new way of commemorating those lost in wartime, listing their names on memorials and annual events to remember. We will find war heroes to admire, and none will be more dashing than the newest edition, pilots. The public will follow the exploits of some pilots by name. Pilots were often outgoing personalities, and they became the rock stars of the war. They were glamorous, and most of them were doomed. Some of what they wore was Army issue, but much was not. They mixed personal style with necessity, and men all over the world wanted to look like them. No one intrigued the public more than Baron von Richthofen, the Red Baron. Even though he flew for the enemy, he was admired as probably the best flying ace of the war. Not only was he a good pilot, but he was a snappy dresser too. He and many other pilots commissioned leather coats that were not military issue. We would emerge from the war with a new fascination for leather jackets and coats. We end the war with more than just changes to fashion. We are poised to become modern people. One important signal is after decades of women demanding the right to vote, Britain, Canada, and a number of European countries finally granted in acknowledgement of their war work. In 1920, the U.S. government will give up its long fight against women's suffrage. They too could no longer pretend after World War I that women weren't capable. Our dogs in history for this unit are the dogs of war. Dogs enter modern warfare, serving on the front, even outfitted with their own gas masks. There were several dogs who became famous for their service. My favorite is Sergeant Helen Kaiser, who was twice decorated for bravery in the trenches. She endured being gassed and wounded in France, and she was the first American dog to enter German territory. She did all of this before the age of 15 months.